Hello everyone. Thanks. It's fun to see a few new faces in here. I'm Kim, and we are going to spend probably the next full hour going through a subject property, and I'm going to be putting to in the chat a file, and it will be our subject property and some buyer assumptions. So what I'm going to do today, I've already kind of filled out the offer. And so we're just going to be going through the answers, like kind of like an answer key. So let me know once you've got the PDF opened, and then I'm going to start to share my screen. Can you guys see my screen with the offer practice document?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, great. Just going to scroll in a little bit. So we kind of follow the same format and method every week for offer practice. So we've got a property here that's in Menominee Falls, and I will open up MLS in a second, but let's talk a little bit about who our buyer is. So for this week, I've used Mr. Willis Love, our wonderful director of agent engagement. He signed a buyer agency with us back at the end of May, on May 31st, and agreed to our compensation of 2.4%. And our buyer agency is a quick one. It's only valid for 45 days. So he's got some things that he is looking for. From a closing perspective, he's looking to close on or after July 2nd. He's pre-approved with a local lender and is planning on putting 15% down. And we'll just, for our practice today, we'll leverage a 7.5% interest rate. And we can make some assumptions too about the seller, but before I get into that, I'm actually just going to pull up the address and pull up the listing in MLS. Can you guys see this okay?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay, so what we've got here is a 4-bed, 3.5 bath, single family home in Menominee Falls. Asking price is $689. It is part of an HOA, which that'll come into play in our offer because we have to acknowledge that. But usually what I like to do right away when I open up the listing is go immediately here to private remarks. And there might be some additional information that is going to be helpful for us as we draft our offer in terms of seller preferences. There might also be some information as to how earnest money should be delivered and who will be holding earnest money. So here the private remarks are pretty standard. It just says square footage and room sizes aren't verified. Electronic earnest money is encouraged through trust funds. And then this, they actually had an offer deadline for the weekend and they just haven't removed it. I don't think that this house actually got an offer yet. But they were just asking for offers to be submitted by June 1st, and they were going to have a decision on June 2nd. So this is a little bit outdated, which is fine. And you'll see kind of how we're going to just craft our offer to meet some of those seller preferences. But here are inclusions, and then there's some exclusions as well. If I take a quick look at the document section, we've just got the seller condition report. So I'm going to be, if this was really a true offer submission, I'd be downloading this information or this document onto my computer so I could then upload it into zip forms and then get my buyers to sign it. But the thing that I'm taking note of for offer practice today is the date with which this was filled out, and it was May 19th, because that will need to be put on our offer. So if I go back to our offer sheet, this is what we're going to do. Everybody has the same instruction. So I like to say each week during offer practice, this isn't competitive offer practice. This is just good old blocking and tackling foundational offer practice help. So if you do choose to submit your practice offer, and I always encourage people to do that, send me your offer packet by tomorrow at 1, and then I'll be sending you feedback. I'll take a look at it and let you know if I have any comments, questions, etc. But if you do choose to do the practice offer, everybody has the same instruction. So we're going to offer what they're asking, 689,000. We are, in terms of inclusions and exclusions, going to use everything that they just put on MLS. But if this was a real scenario, make sure you do check with your buyers and review what is being offered as an inclusion and see if that's what they want. And then also review what's being listed as an exclusion as well. So everyone's crystal clear. For our offer today, we are going to have a closing date of July 8th. So give or take a month and a few extra days. Our earnest money is going to be $7,000. And in our market, we know that earnest money is anywhere between 1% to 3% typically of the purchase price. So I've just put give or take 1% here. And then there's going to be some additional contingencies. So we'll have a home inspection. We are going to get the radon tested, financing, seller compensation. We'll go to the buyer's firm and then request for seller closing credits is what we're going to be. This is kind of the new thing that we're going to do this week. Has anyone ever asked for closing credits? No. It's not terribly common right now in our market, but we are seeing a little bit of that shift into buyers being able to add some additional contingencies into the offer and get it accepted. One note about seller closing credits, you just can't create an arbitrary dollar amount that your buyers want in credits. I've seen some offers come through the helpline where the purchase price is like $250,000 and the buyer wants $50,000 in closing cost credits. You need to check with your buyer's lender as to how much they are able to request in closing cost credits. So it's very, it's not just a willy-nilly number. You should be checking with your buyer's lender if that is in fact something that your buyers want to entertain. But the other thing that we're going to do here is also have a home warranty, and we're going to have that purchased by the seller. So if I go into zip forms, and I've already kind of started this, and I have to fill in some gaps here, but and this isn't this isn't zip form training. So I've already started to put the answers to our offer here in zip forms. But today's date is here right on the top of line or on line 1. And because we are working as an agent of our buyer, Mr. Love, he signed the buyer agency agreement with us. So that makes him our client. And therefore, we are the agent of the buyer. So I've kept that line open and I've struck out the other 2 options. I've put his name here in line 3, the street address for the property. And in line 6, we have to determine what type of municipality it is. Is it in the village? Is it in a city? Is it in a town? And if you go to MLS, it'll show you just what municipality type it is if you don't know. So here we go. Right down here, it says municipality village. If you also don't know what county the property is in, because that's going to be the next line, MLS also tells you here what county the property is in. So if I go back to zip forms, here's our address. It's in the village of Menominee Falls and it's in the county of Waukesha. We're offering 689,000. So I've put that number here in line 10 and it'll then automatically populate with the language above. And then for our inclusions and exclusions, I just copied everything out of MLS and pasted it into these lines here. Now, again, make sure you check with your buyers as to whether or not they want all of the inclusions, or maybe they want to add an additional inclusion. The same could be true for your exclusions as well. So just make sure you review these things so there's no surprises come your final walkthrough. If your buyer was expecting a washer and dryer, but you never wrote it into the offer and it's not there, bad news. So just make sure you're crystal clear with that. For offer practice, for those that are new, I don't go through things line by line. Like I'm really just trying to get through the main parts of the offer, but it is your responsibility to become familiar with what's in the document. And the more practice you get, the more comfortable you're going to get. But as Joan Reed, our compliance broker in the North Shore office, always says, if you have a question, 99% of the time the answer is right there in the document. You just have to read it. So make sure you're familiar and comfortable with it. So I've put binding acceptance here for June 5th in line 40. The sellers were asking initially for about 48 hours of binding acceptance. So that's what I've done here. Anytime you have a date in your offer, it'll automatically go through 11:59 p.m. of that date. But if you wanted to be a little bit more specific and say, maybe I'm only going to give them until 8 p.m. on June 5th, you can do that too. But just note, if you don't specify a time, it'll automatically go until the end of the day. Now, binding acceptance takes place when both parties are in receipt of an accepted offer. Closing, I've put here as July 8th. And my zip forms automatically populates this language here at the place selected by the buyer. So therefore, I've closed or crossed off at the place selected by the seller because it's redundant now, or it contradicts one another. This is pretty common for buyers and their lenders to have the opportunity to select where they want to have closing. Moving to the top then of page 2, I make sure that zip forms has carried through the entire address to page 2. Sometimes it doesn't carry through, so just make sure you double check. And if you do need to add anything, all you have to do is click in the line and just fill in the remaining categories. But our first item here on page 2 is earnest money. So we are going to be delivering earnest money of $7,000, and that is going to be delivered after the offer is accepted. It's going to be held by the listing firm. So I've left that open and I've crossed out drafting firm and otherwise identified. As the private remarks in MLS indicated, this listing agent and seller do prefer trust funds to be used as it pertains to earnest money. So trust funds is something that is the method with which the earnest money is provided, but it's still being held by the listing firm. So sometimes we get questions like, it's being held by trust funds. What do I need to put on line 60? It still will be the listing firm. Then these lines underneath that section talk about disbursement of earnest money if the transaction actually doesn't get to closing. So it's not an automatic given that a buyer gets money back, or it's not an automatic given that a seller tries to keep the money. So you just need to make sure you understand the options and that you are talking through the various scenarios that might happen with your buyer. The next section here, the condition report. So a seller in the state of Wisconsin is required to provide a condition report if they've lived in the property at any time. A seller does not have to fill out that report if maybe it's being sold by a trust and the personal representative was never lived at the home. But for our case today, the seller has lived there. And if you recall, I took a look at what the date was on the condition report that was provided, and I put that date here in line 107. So this just indicates that the condition report has been provided. It doesn't mean that your buyers necessarily agree with it, but you're acknowledging that you have in fact received one. Now here on page 3, again, just double checking that the top line here has the correct address. But page 3 is a list of all the things that might be included in the condition report as it pertains to defects or easements or things like that. So usually you don't see many things crossed off here or that page modified. But our first contingency here is our home inspection. So we know that our buyer wants to have the home inspected and that the offer is going to be contingent on having the home inspected. So I've checked the box here in line 193. And make sure that read this through carefully and that you talk about this too with your buyer. A home inspection is different than a test. An inspection is something that is just a visible observation with the eye. So I always think of eye inspection. Test takes something away from the property and takes it to a lab. So test, take, TT. We are just talking here about having a home inspection. I've checked the box indicating that we are going to have one conducted by a licensed home inspector. And that also in this section, it automatically gives us the opportunity to have follow-up inspections by other contractors if they were recommended by or if the estimate or the follow-up was recommended by the initial home inspector. Your buyers don't have to do it, but this is giving your buyers that opportunity to do that if they do, in fact, want to have follow-up inspections. Now, the contingency satisfied, and I put here on line 206, 10 days. This is the number of days that you have to schedule the home inspection, have the home inspection, have any follow-up inspections that your buyer does want to take advantage of, and any and all negotiations have to take place within these 10 days. This does not mean you just have to have the home inspection done by then. That's not the case at all. So the first, couple of weeks, once you get an accepted offer are typically the busiest and maybe even the most stressful just for all parties because it typically is this section that includes the home inspection. So I'm not going to go, I always send after offer practice, I'll send you guys an email that has trainings specifically on this section of the offer, just on the home inspection. But I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because we do have those other trainings that are going to really dive into the section of the offer. But just note, like if you're having a home inspection and you put the number of days here, again, it doesn't mean that's when you just have to have the inspection completed by. That's when everything needs to be figured out. And if you have negotiations and those negotiations result in some type of repair work being agreed to, or maybe a reduction in price or a credit, all of that will be determined and put in writing in the form of an amendment within these 10 days. Now, we're going to give the seller the right to cure. So I've crossed off shall not have the right to cure. And in our market right now, it's still very common and advantageous for buyers to give the seller the right to cure. Giving the seller the right to cure isn't an automatic given that a seller is going to actually do something if you ask for it. This is just giving the seller the opportunity to almost have like a first right of refusal. But if the seller has the right to cure, the seller can satisfy the contingency by sending a notice back to the buyer after the buyer delivered a notice of defect. So let's just take a quick step back. Like say we're on day 10 here and we haven't come to any type of an agreement and we're at a stalemate and we just cannot get things in writing and an agreement between the two parties. If you don't send over a notice of defect, or if you don't have an amendment that has both parties' signature on it that indicates how things are going to be resolved or credited or fixed, if you don't have that done within 10 days, on day 11, your buyer has just purchased the house as is, and you have no opportunity to go back. So it's really important that you manage your dates and deadlines. But let's say we're on day 10 and we're having an issue and we can't get the seller and the buyers to agree on a solution. Then it's time to send a notice of defect, and that comes from the buyer, and the buyer should be prepared to walk from the deal if the seller chooses not to now fix everything that was included in that notice. So again, I'm not going to go into detail. I'll send you guys a link for an additional training on this. But we're giving the seller the right to cure, and it says here in black and white. The seller can satisfy the contingency if the seller provides a notice back to the buyer, and I put within 2 days. So the buyer sends a notice of defect and it lists all the things that are wrong with the house. We're giving the seller 2 days to deliver a notice back to us, indicating that they're going to cure the defects. The seller also satisfies the contingency by curing the defects in a good and workmanlike manner and sending a report back to the buyer no later than 3 days prior to closing, which outlines all the work that was done. So that's how it's cured. The seller or the offer is null and void. So the offer is dead if the buyer sent a notice of defects along with the inspection report. And it's okay to send the inspection report, and you should send the inspection report to the listing agent. But the offer is dead if the seller never had the right to cure to begin with. And in that situation, the buyer would have had the upper hand from the get-go. Or the offer is dead if the seller had the right to cure, but the seller sends a note back saying they're not going to cure, or the seller doesn't deliver a notice back to the buyer within these 2 days. So it's really important that you're on top of your dates and deadlines. I'm going to move into the radon test. So I see this happen a lot too, where people don't strike this box and they add the radon test to this up here. And that's not correct. We have a whole separate contingency just for the radon test. So we know that our buyer wants to have the test. I've checked the box indicating that the offer is contingent upon that. And in our market right now, the buyer is the one paying for that test. And usually a lot of home inspectors can add the radon test onto the home inspection. But a lot of times here in line 10, we follow the same time frame as it pertains to our deadline. We follow the same time frame as the home inspection. So if we had 10 days up here to get all of our ducks in a row and negotiated, the same thing holds true for the radon test. So I've put 10 days here. And if you see, we've got another section here. Who has the right to cure the radon test if it should come back high? We're giving the seller the right to cure. And typically the way in which a seller cures this is by installing some type of radon mitigation system. So again, reading it line by line, if the seller had the right to cure, they can satisfy it by delivering a notice back to the buyer saying they're going to cure it. They have to do that within 10 days. And then they also install a radon mitigation system, and all of that information and a report and a follow-up test has to be done within 3 days prior to closing. The deal is dead or null and void if the buyer sends a notice back to the seller indicating that the radon was high, and the deal is dead if the seller never had the right to cure to begin with and your buyers are willing to walk. Or if the seller had the right to cure, they just didn't send information back indicating that they would cure it in a timely manner. Okay. Moving on, financing. We know that our buyer is going to be getting a loan. So I've checked the box indicating that financing is a contingency within our offer. I have put here on line 249 the type of loan that our buyer is going to be getting. So if they were getting a VA loan, an FHA loan, you could change that information here in line 249. But for Mr. Love, our buyer, we've got a 30-year conventional. In terms of our time frame for when we will turn loan commitment around, I've put 25 days. I always check with the lender to see how fast a loan commitment might be able to be delivered. And note, the lender can work fast, but the lender also is going to be relying on the buyer to be providing information to them as well. So it's important that your buyers are ready to go and that they can help make fast deadlines. Typically, a home or a financing contingency is anywhere between like 21 and 30 days. A lender could do it faster than that, but it all just depends on how fast the buyer can get their documentation together and how fast we can get an appraisal done. But for our practice today, I've just put 25 days. Then for the remaining part of this section, I always use a mortgage calculator to help identify or help fill in some of these blanks. So the financing that's going to be used by the buyer, this number here represents the principal amount of the loan. So we're taking our purchase price of $689,000 and we're subtracting the 15% down payment that was in the offer instructions. And I'm just going to double check my math here. Let me see here. I've got a purchase price of $689,000 and we're putting 15% down. That means our down payment is $103,350. So this amount here again is your purchase price minus your down payment amount, which then equals the principal of $585,650. Our loan is for 30 years and our loan is going to be amortized over 30 years. So these two numbers match. And then the amount of money here in line 252 represents the monthly payment of that your buyer will make just as it pertains to its principal and interest. It doesn't include taxes, PMI, it doesn't include homeowners insurance. It strictly represents the initial monthly payments of principal and interest. I've plugged in 15% for our down payment. I'm using a 7.5% interest rate, and this is what I get then for my monthly payment. If your buyer was buying down points on their mortgage, you would be putting something in here, but we aren't, so I've left that blank. I've checked the box in line 264. We are getting a fixed rate mortgage, meaning it's going to be the same interest rate every year for the duration of the loan. So I've put 7.5. If you aren't quite sure what interest rate to put there, ask the lender. They can give you some guidance as to where mortgage rates are at. Usually we put a little bit of a cushion here, just in the event if something, changes between now when the offer's written and when your buyer locks in the rate. But all of this talks here then below talks about how your buyer satisfies the financing commitment. So I'm not going to go through that. So just make sure that you read carefully. And then the first contingency that we are not including is seller financing. This is where the seller would help really like the buyer with financing. So rather than leaving that box blank because we aren't going to include it, I put NA, not applicable. If your buyer was paying with cash and not getting a loan, we'd be filling in this section here, but our offer is not contingent on a cash buyer or a cash deal. Our offer is contingent on financing, so I'm going to skip it. The next section here is the appraisal contingency. So this appraisal contingency is used to specify what steps can be taken and who has the right to cure if the appraised amount comes back lower than the purchase price. So by checking this box, this just doesn't mean we're going to have an appraisal contingency or an appraisal done. This is something a little bit more than that. So it's contingent upon the buyer or the buyer's lender having the property appraised. The contingency shall be deemed satisfied within 21 days. I usually put my appraisal contingency a few days shorter than my financing contingency. So if you recall earlier, financing was going to be due within 25 days. I've put 21 days here. And we're going to give the seller the right to cure. And what this means is, and I'm going to kind of go back here. The contingency is deemed satisfied unless the buyer within 21 days after acceptance delivers to the seller a copy of the appraisal report, indicating the appraised value is less than the agreed purchase price. So let's say we're buying or we're offering $689,000. And maybe the appraisal comes in and the appraiser says it's appraised at $680,000. So now we have a $9,000 difference. What this contingency here allows us to do is ask the seller to cure. And if the seller does have the right to cure, they can satisfy the contingency by sending a notice back to the buyer adjusting to the purchase price shown on the appraisal report. So you are, in fact, if the appraisal comes in low, you should be sending the appraisal report to the listing agent so they have proof and verification that it did come in low. If the appraised value comes in higher than what your purchasing price is, don't send it to the listing agent. They don't need to know that. That's for your buyer's knowledge only, and good for your buyer. Then they're buying a house for less than actually what it's worth. But here we're asking the seller to adjust the purchase price to the value shown on the report within 10 or 2 days after they actually get that report. So during this time too, you're having conversations with the other party. So I don't give much time here, because if we're having that open dialogue, it's not going to be a surprise when we are going to be asking for a purchase price reduction because the appraisal came in low. Now, once the seller does agree, and hopefully they will, they don't have to, but if the seller agrees to adjust the purchase price, then you actually will be executing an amendment that officially adjusts that purchase price to the new value. But the offer could be dead if the seller never had the right to cure to begin with, or the seller does have the right to cure, but they're not going to adjust the purchase price, or the seller had the right to cure, but they didn't get back to us within those 2 days within a timely manner. So again, familiarize yourself with the language within the contract. It's very helpful. Our buyer doesn't have a home to sell, or our buyers, I'll rephrase this. Our buyer doesn't need to sell another house in order to purchase this house. So there's no home sale contingency. I've put NA. Because there's no home sale contingency, usually a bump clause accompanies the home inspection or home sale contingency. So I put NA. And I don't like how this looks. I'm going to put NA. And this is not going to be a secondary offer. We're writing to get in primary position. So I've put NA here. We have to give some direction as it pertains to how things like taxes or any type of assessments are going to be prorated between the two parties. So here I've checked the box in line 66, indicating that we're going to take last year's tax amount, and we're going to prorate that between the two parties. You don't have to figure out the amounts. The title company will help do that on the closing statement, but you do have to select one of these boxes here indicating how taxes are going to be prorated. And if you don't know, or maybe it's new construction and the value taxes haven't been figured out yet because it was vacant land and now it's got a house on it. So the value is going to be different. If you don't know what box to check, by all means, give your PC coach a call, or you can call the helpline, or you can call a compliance broker and they can help you identify what might be the best option for your buyers. Then this section here talks about title, what title is. Sellers typically are the ones that are getting title insurance and gap insurance, but please make sure you familiarize yourself with this language and you know what the section how it reads. Then there's some definitions here that I'm not going to go through. This also indicates that the buyer needs to be the one that takes on any of the ownership as it pertains to verifying square footage. Like, you are held not liable for that. It's really up to the buyers to do their due diligence. The home has to be kept in the same condition that it was in as of the date of the offer, minus any normal wear and tear. So that's just stated here. And then if there is some type of damage to the home between now and closing, if the damage is less than 5% of the purchase price, the seller is required to notify the buyer of what's going on. The seller is responsible then for bringing the home back into the same condition and fixing it and putting it into the same condition that the home was in as of the date of the offer. And then the seller is also responsible for providing all lien waivers and permits and all that stuff. Now, back to the buyer. Now, if the damage exceeds 5% of the purchase price, then the seller still has to immediately notify the buyer as to what's going on, and the buyer can put in writing that they want to terminate the offer. but there's some additional language in here. So make sure, again, you take some time and you just walk through it. Then speaking of walkthrough, here on the top of page 9, your buyer does have the opportunity to have a final walkthrough within 3 days prior to closing. I always like to find out, and this is usually the last thing that gets scheduled in a transaction because you want to make sure you get through all of your contingencies. But this is your opportunity to see if the inclusions that we had written into the offer have been left behind, if there was any repair or any type of work that had to get done as part of the contract. This is your chance also to see that all of those repairs were made. The buyer at the time of closing actually gets to take occupancy unless it's otherwise stated. Maybe you're giving the seller some post-closing occupancy. Maybe they need to stay for a couple extra days, what have you. Then you would be drafting a separate addendum. But your buyer gets occupancy of the property right at the time of closing once they get keys. If either party defaults on an element of this contract, you are not a lawyer and you cannot provide legal advice. You can refer your buyers to seek legal representation from a lawyer, but this area here within the contract just talks about every party has to do their due diligence and act in good faith to complete the terms of the offer. If one of the parties fails to perform, your client does have an opportunity to do some type of legal action, but you just cannot help with that. I'm going to go then to the top of page 10. Our final contingency here is line 543. So this is where we're asking that the seller pay for your commission. And I put 2.4% of the purchase price. That's what is in our buyer agency agreement. Now, your buyer doesn't have to include this as a contingency. If your buyer wants to pay you directly out of pocket at closing, that's great. And it's actually one less contingency and could make your offer really attractive to the seller. But for our practice today, we are going to be asking the seller to compensate the buyer's firm. And you'll notice here I put 2.4% of the purchase price. And then you'll see some language here that was added to the additional provision section. So I like to make sure that this here at the top is always included, that if a deadline falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or a holiday, the deadline gets extended to the next business day. The only time that doesn't happen is binding acceptance. That can happen 365 days a year. And if you need this language, I just click on the box and I hit add clause over here. And here we have 22 clauses that our lawyers have given us the thumbs up to use as it pertains to some of the most frequently added, I guess, additional provisions. You've got the business day deadline. So that's the one that I just talked about. Here it is. If any contingency follows or expires on whatever date, all I did was hit insert. Then the other language that I've added here is if we're having a home inspection and we're giving the seller the right to cure, I want to make sure that the seller uses professional licensed experts. It's done in a good and workmanlike manner. So the same way that I added the deadline contingency or the deadline language, I'm going to add clause, global library, and you'll see a bunch of stuff here. And I put right to cure, and here it is, and I just hit insert. And then to wrap this up, in terms of how we're going to be delivering documents, I still put in person. Maybe I'm going to be delivering some hard copies to the listing agent. That's who I put here on line 576, name of seller's recipient. It's not the seller's name, it's actually the listing agent. And the name of the buyer's recipient for delivery would be you, not the buyer. And that follows the same approach too for how are we going to send documents electronically via email. The email address for the seller is actually the listing agents, and you can find that on MLS. And then the email address for the buyer is yours. You're the buyer's agent. We're going to be including addendum A within our offer. So I've checked that box. Make sure you put your name and your brokerage name in line 593. I see a lot of people in offer practice forget to put that, so make sure you do that. And that's really it for the main offer document. So I'm just going to go back up here. I'm going to hit save. And then we're going to wrap up today with our GMAR Addendum A. And for you guys that are in Madison, I'm not sure if you use the GMAR version of Addendum A or if you use the WRA's version. But we typically use the GMAR version, and you can tell what version it is by just looking at the top left-hand corner. If this was the WRA version, it would say, Wisconsin Realtors Association. But here is our Addendum A, and we're going to be using it in a couple of places. We've put our address, our address. We've also put the date that we're drafting the offer and our buyer's name. But here's where we talk about the closing cost credits. So I've seen a lot of practice offers where we talk about seller closing cost credits. Like people are adding that language into some of the blank lines in the offer to purchase and the additional provisions. You don't need to do that. You just need to check the box here on line 7. Seller shall give a buyer a loan cost credit and or prepayables at closing in the amount of blank. And so in our offer instructions, I said we are going to ask for a $5,000 credit. Now, note, this might make your offer less attractive to the seller, but just for practice today, I want people to start understanding just the section. Now, remember also, make sure you ask your buyer's lender if you are hoping to get a closing cost credit from the seller, find out from the lender how much money they are able to get, because there is going to be a maximum amount. We also are using Addendum A because we're going to be asking the seller for a home warranty. So I've checked the box here in line 10. And the cost of the home warranty shall not exceed $495. This is a pretty standard, minimum home warranty plan. Usually if the seller was offering a plan, the listing agent would indicate what plan and for how much. But today I just threw this one in there just for fun. So we're going to be asking for a home warranty. The seller is going to be paying for it. And the home warranty will actually be then ordered by the listing agent. And that's pretty common. Now, one thing that I just realized is incorrect. We know based on MLS, if I go back here real quick, there's HOA dues to living in this subdivision, and the dues are $175 a year. We need to acknowledge that we're aware of that, or that the buyer is aware of that. So I'm going to go back to Addendum A, and I'm going to put an X in line 15. Buyer acknowledges that there's an association fee of, and I'm going to put $175 per year. Now, the remaining elements of this addendum are not going to be ones that we need to worry about today. If we were having something specifically tested, like for mold or asbestos, or you wanted to have like the water in the pool tested, you'd be marking this box. If the home was on a private well and you wanted to have the well tested as well as the well water tested, you'd be filling out these sections of the document. Or if the home was on its own private sanitary system, so like a septic tank, a holding tank, or a mound system, you can have that tested. So we would be marking the box here and then talking about timelines and deadlines and who's going to pay for what. But we're not doing that today because our home is on city or municipal water and sewer. On page 2 here, you've got just some additional language around the right to cure, around financing. Make sure you familiarize yourself with it because it actually has some protections in there for your buyers. If your buyer was getting a VA loan, we would have to be checking this box here, indicating that, and then there's some extra steps that will need to be taken as part of that loan. This here, page 3, talks about, zoning, building restrictions, surveys, insurance. So just make sure you are familiar with what's included in here. But we don't fill anything else out on this form. Actually, this is not right because there is no lead paint. If you did have a lead paint addendum, if the house was built before 1978, you would be checking this box and putting a addendum S here. But we don't need to do that today because the house was built in 1997. But what we do need to fill out then is the bottom of this document. And over here on the left-hand side is all of the information for you and your firm. You're the buyer's firm. Put your information here, including license number, phone number, email, etc. And then over here is information for the listing agent. And why isn't this? Oh, that didn't what I wanted it to do. So this is actually good practice because where do you get all the information for the listing agent? You get it from MLS. If I scroll all the way down, here it is right here. LO means the listing office's license number. LA means the listing agent's license number. So I'm going to literally copy. Why isn't this working? Copy and paste it into here for Judy's her license number. Her email address is J Moffett, and her phone number is 262-994. Okay. And that's it. That's addendum A. So those are going to be the only documents that we are going to be reviewing today. If you do want to participate and send me your practice offer, again, please email me by tomorrow at 1. And in your offer packet, you'll have the offer to purchase. You would have GMAR Addendum A. You would have your condition report because your buyer's going to have to sign that. And then in the real world, you'd also have a copy of your buyer's pre-approval letter. But that's kind of what's in your offer packet. This one's pretty simple. It's only 3 documents. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Does anybody have any questions? I know I went through stuff fast, but take a stab at it by all means and send me your practice. More practice, the better. As Charlie always says, practicing on your clients is malpractice. So don't do that. Okay, very good. Well, I'll send you all an email after this with the PDF of the offer instructions and then some links to the home inspection. And I think I also have a link to another training that talks about the financing section too. So you guys have that. Okay. Thanks for joining. It's nice to meet you. Bye,
Thank
Griffin.
you.
Okay, bye-bye.